Previously on Dallas.
My wife? Honey, this is Gary. My brother, Gary.
Pam rushes to the hospital to check on Digger. He's suffering through the DTs and nearly died. Pam apologizes for pressuring him to come to Southfork, the humiliation that obviously triggered his fall off the wagon. Meanwhile, Valene is hesitant to return to Southfork. Gary reassures her that things are different now.
Jock's easier, he's not so hard anymore. JR's fine, almost like a real brother.
Gary and Valene explain to each other the decisions they made 16 years prior. Gary, feeling suffocated by JR and Jock, bolted from the ranch. Valene was forced off by JR shortly thereafter and didn't put up much of a fight for Lucy because she thought that Miss Ellie would at least raise her right. It's at this point where you have to wonder how much JR was behind the good old boys who tracked Valene and Lucy down in Virginia. Lucy was the first sole heir to the Ewing throne from that generation, although having a vagina pretty much excluded her from the family business line. It was really not in JR's best interest to bring her back unless he was trying to curry favor with Jock and Ellie. Valene and Gary gush like school kids when they hear that they're both single. Ah. The reception at Southfork is, of course, pretty chilly, except for Bobby. JR apologizes for his past behavior back in the day, but it's all very awkward. Pam wants to take care of Digger, but Digger's sister Maggie tells her he doesn't want to see her. A revelation that twists like a knife in Pam's stomach. Ray helps to get Gary acclimated to the new Southfork, including a lesson in economics.
Look at all this. It just seems to me we could be raising 4 or 5 times as many head of cattle.
There would be no profit in it.
Why?
Subsidies. Better off not raising them.
This brings up an interesting commentary about farming and ranching that persists in 2020. The mythology of the American farmer and rancher, and particularly of the Ewings, is that they are entirely self-made, hard work, determination, and grit. But as writer David Jacobs touches on in this scene, a lot of the larger agribusinesses owe at least part of their success to massive wealth transfers from taxpayers. In 2020 alone, the American federal government paid farmers $37.2 billion, which accounts for over 36% of farm income. So nearly 1/3 of income comes in the form of subsidies. That's not nearly the rough and tumble origin story we get from the likes of Jock. Lucy is anxious to get Valene and Gary back together, including the suggestion that Gary fire Ray Krebbs and take over for him.
I wouldn't do that, Lucy.
Why not? He isn't much.
Yikes. JR shows up and lays out the offer, a can't-miss subsidiary that refines the byproduct of the crude oil. The offer is too good to be true, which only Valene seems to recognize. She tells Gary to pack up and run, but Gary is too high on cow pies to recognize he's being duped. Pam returns to Digger's house and Aunt Maggie shoos her away. Maggie thinks that being at Southfork made everything real for Digger. Maggie also shows that she's a bit more realistic about who was at fault in the rift between Digger and Jock.
Digger's blaming Jock. You went for all the misfortune he ever had. And some of the blame is Jock's, but not all.
Pam insists on seeing her father, but Digger tells her that she's dead to him. Bobby tries to get Gary to take a break, but JR masterfully swoops in and guilts Gary into pushing himself too hard. This is truly the best of JR, passive-aggressively using language to manipulate people.
Well, now, Gary does have a lot of catching up to do. Has a little daughter that he wants to respect him, and maybe even a wife again.
Valene tells Bobby she's worried about what the pressure of running a company will do to Gary. Bobby, always with the blind spot, says he has faith in both Gary and JR, but he also warns JR off doing anything to mess with Gary. A drunken Digger barrels into Southfork and says he forgoes compensation for stealing the oil well and Miss Ellie, but he will accept payment from the Ewings for stealing Pamela. $10,000. Jock, never one to miss an opportunity to humiliate Digger, throws a $100 bill at him, which Digger accepts.
Sold.
Oh boy. Gary accidentally knocks over a glass of milk, triggering all of the women to dote on him. Gary flips out and rushes to the alcohol table. Valene sees him, but lets him make the decision for himself in a nice moment. The next morning, Gary makes the healthiest decision of his life and decides to leave. Valene confronts him and asks him what his plans are. Gary tells her that he still loves her, but he can't take all of the toxic behavior of the Ewings. Val kisses him goodbye and tells him that she never loved another man the way that she loves him.
I don't wanna wait
JR overhears the goodbye and warns Val to get out of Dodge in one of the most crisply written scenes in the series. Everyone believes that Gary just ran off again. Miss Ellie is crestfallen. Jock is judgmental and says that people just don't change. And Lucy is heartbroken and angry. The A-plot and the B-plot come together nicely into sync as Pamela is inspired by Gary's gentle nature to return to Digger. This is a great moment for Victoria Principal, allowing her to be hurt, defiant, and acerbic all in one scene.
Don't be stupid. Keep it. The old house owes you a lot more than that.
Gary's departure finally pushes Bobby to the boiling point, and he suspects JR had something to do with it. He goes off on an amazing rant about how much he respects Gary for not falling into the toxic games that the Ewings play with people. JR still has one final shoe to drop, though, telling Lucy that her mother extorted money from him before she left. This is the second half of Dallas's two-part return and the relaunch of the show as a regular 24-episode series. The writers clearly recognized that if they were going to be a full series rather than a mini-series, they would need to expand the cast and flesh out some of the side characters. So Digger's widowed sister shows up, Valene makes her first appearance, and of course Gary, a presence that was looming over the first season, makes a return. I already spoke about how much I liked David Ackroyd's performance as Gary in Part 1, but he seems far more at home here, no pun intended. Like Bobby, he wants to see the best in people, so he's quick to defend his family from Valene's suspicions. But when he's on his own, he's a bundle of nerves and twitches. Joan Van Ark is equally good as Valene, and it's no wonder the producers wanted to throw them into a spin-off together. Valene is smart enough to be constantly skeptical of JR's motives, but the antiquated gender roles on Southfork don't give her much power to do anything about it besides shout warnings. I will say that I like the second part of the two-parter much more than the first. The first episode of Season 2 spends much of its time reintroducing the character dynamics and establishing that yes, Gary is one of the many things that cause tension between Jock and Ellie. The second episode is where JR does his nastiest work and where we get a lot more of the volatile family dynamics between Gary and the rest. Plus, the first episode relies on a sitcom coincidence that has always bothered me. Lucy finds Valene and Gary stumbles upon Pam and Bobby within weeks of one another, independently, after 16 years. That's a hell of a coincidence to set up the events of the episode. The writing in episode 2, however, is tighter and crisper. The emotions are more raw. The final exchange between Valene and JR briefly crackles. And I wish that the series had more moments like this for Hagman to chew on.
Any choices?
$5,000 and escort out of state.
Any others?
Escort out of state.
The dialogue on this show never had the polish of a Joss Whedon or Aaron Sorkin, but we do get the occasional shining exchange between characters, and this is one of them. One of the things the writers of Dallas love to do is their parallels. It may sound silly to talk about motifs in a soapy melodrama, or anywhere outside of your literature class for that matter, but Dallas uses them to great effect. A motif, for the uninitiated, is a story element that is used repeatedly in a work in order to drive home a dominant idea. For example, Reunion Part 2 features two alcoholic men, both driven to the bottle by Ewing men, both of whom lost the loves of their lives, and both of whom lost daughters to the Ewing family. Digger has let the bottle consume him, driving a wedge between Pamela and himself. Gary made that same mistake 16 years prior, but this time he learns and refuses to take that fatal drink. In a good series, the actions of one character can tell us a lot about the actions of another character who is placed in the same situation. Both Gary and Digger abandon their daughters, but Gary does so out of love, thinking that Lucy will be better off with the stability that the Ewings can provide. Digger does so out of selfish, drunken spite. The second episode also seems to understand the murky area of family dynamics a little better than the opener. Everything from the moment Gary considers taking the drink on is fantastic stuff. Gary recognizes that he is not the problem in the relationship. He's actually the healthy one, and that's why he can't be around the other Ewings.
Couple of days here and I was almost back to the bottle.
You might have seen that motivational quote circulating on the internet that the black sheep of a toxic family is sometimes the only one telling the truth. That's a little oversimplified, but there is a grain of truth to it. Families who have members with narcissistic traits, especially in the heads of the family, may wind up triangulating. That is, they may pit two family members against one another, or try to recruit family members to their side.
Ewing Oil can have only one man at the helm, and that's got to be the man that wants it the most.
We see this most often in step families, where children may try to make their biological parent side with them over a step-parent, or two divorcing parents who try to use their child as a pawn. The Ewings definitely fit that mold, with JR feeling competitive with just about everyone over the love of his father, Miss Ellie favoring Gary, and Bobby trying desperately to keep the peace. Bobby's bias towards positivity is something we'll continue to see play out throughout the season. It's portrayed as an endearing trait because he's the good brother, But here he's so anxious to reunite the family that he doesn't even listen to Gary's discomfort about the idea.
That doesn't mean I'm ready for a family reunion.
Now look at you. You're fine. You're solid as a rock.
And it nearly drives Gary back to the bottle. Toxic positivity refers to an excessive and ineffective overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state across all situations. We'll deal with it more in another video, but suffice it to say, Bobby Ewing embodies this concept in the early episodes. Reunion Part 2 is a fun welcome back and a precursor of what the show would one day become. A soapy family melodrama about power, loyalty, and individuality, with people backstabbing each other and exploiting each other's insecurities. But at least Pam and Bobby are happy.